Welcome back to the deep dive. This time we're going deep with Etienne Balibar's identity and difference, his take on John Locke's concept of consciousness and personal identity.
Yeah, it's not just Locke on his own, though.
Right.
Balibar puts him in conversation with, Descartes, Spinoza, adds a lot more depth.
Okay, so to set the stage, Balibar's looking at Locke's An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, chapter 27 specifically. It's a key text in the evolution of how we think about consciousness and the self.
Absolutely.
But he takes a really interesting approach, starting with the translation of Locke's essay by Pierre Coste.
Right. The enigma of translation, as Balibar calls it. So consciousness, the word was relatively new in English at the time, right? And Coste really struggled to find a French equivalent. That struggle, it shows us how these concepts evolved across languages and traditions.
So the translation problem itself opens up a deeper philosophical question.
Yeah, exactly. Balibar uses this to show how Locke's ideas were kind of moving away from conscience as like a moral concept. Locke was suggesting something different.
And that something different is really where Locke shakes things up. Balibar argues that Locke revolutionized the whole idea of the self by suggesting that it's not grounded in a substance, either material or immaterial,
Right.
but in consciousness itself.
And what's fascinating here is that for Locke, the self isn't static or fixed. It's this dynamic process, self-identification, shaped by memory, by reflection, how we take in our experiences. So for Locke, the identity of a substance, think like a rock or a chair, it's all about its continued existence as that specific thing. It's about the material continuity of an object, even as it undergoes superficial changes.
So a rock is the same rock today as it was yesterday, even if it gets chipped or scratched.
Exactly. As long as it's still that same collection of matter, it keeps its identity as that specific substance. It's about the essence of the thing, not its outward appearance.
Gotcha. Okay, so then what about the identity of living organisms? How does that fit in? What makes it different from a simple substance?
Here's where Locke introduces this idea of organization. He argues that living organisms, like plants and animals, they have a distinct identity based on their continuous organization, even if the actual material that makes them up changes over time.
So it's not just about what an organism is made of, but how those materials are organized. That adds another layer of complexity.
Exactly. Think of it like a river. The water's always flowing, always changing, but the river itself remains because of its structure. Similarly, Locke argues that a living organism can maintain its identity even as its cells are replaced. It's the overall organization that persists.
That's a brilliant analogy. I can actually visualize it now. So where does personal identity fit into all of this?
Well, remember, Locke's big idea is that personal identity comes from consciousness. He distinguishes this from the identity of a living organism by saying it's not about our body's physical continuity, but about the continuous flow of our conscious experiences.
So even if our bodies change over time, what defines us is that unbroken chain of thoughts, memories, and perceptions. It's like our own personal narrative.
Precisely. It's a really fascinating concept that challenges the conventional ways we think about the self. It raises all sorts of questions about what consciousness really is, about memory, and the relationship between our minds and bodies.
It's incredible how Locke carefully separates these different kinds of identity. Does he ever bring them back together? I feel like there must be some interplay between them, right?
He does. Locke says that while a person's identity is separate from their body, it's still connected to the body in a very specific way, through action.
Action. Okay, now I'm intrigued. How does that fit in?
Well, Locke argues that the actions our bodies take, they are a key part of our personal identity. Why? Because we experience those actions as our own. He says that our consciousness gives us the sense of ownership over our body's actions, even though our consciousness itself isn't the same thing as our body.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get into the deep end here. So our consciousness isn't our body, but it's still linked to the body through this experience of owning our actions. That's a pretty subtle distinction.
It is. It's subtle but crucial to understanding Locke's theory. And this leads him to another big idea, the concept of self.
Ah, yes, the self. Now we're getting really meta. What's Locke's take on this self? Feels like we're going down a philosophical rabbit hole.
Well, Locke uses self to refer to that conscious thinking part of us that experiences and owns our thoughts and actions. He says, the self, it's what makes a person the same person over time, even as our bodies change and our experiences change.
So the self is like the anchor point of our personal identity. It's what gives us a sense of continuity throughout our lives.
You got it. But as always with Locke, there are some nuances. He admits that our consciousness, and therefore our sense of self, can be interrupted, even divided, Think
Yeah.
about amnesia, or even just imagine a scenario where someone's consciousness gets split between two bodies.
Mind-bending stuff right there. I can see how that idea of a divided consciousness could lead to all sorts of philosophical dilemmas. Okay, so if the self is this process, how does Locke then connect that to personal identity? How do we stay the same person over time if our consciousness is always in flux?
Balibar unpacks this by showing how Locke defines personal identity as the continuity of consciousness, right, over time. It's that thread that connects our past, present, future selves.
Okay.
But this raises some really intriguing questions, right? What happens when that continuity breaks down? Think of memory loss, or even the idea of multiple personalities.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. Locke actually tackled these head-on. Like, he used these thought experiments, imagining a day man and a night man existing in the same body.
Right, those thought experiments, they might seem a little odd at first, but they show us just how deeply Locke was thinking about this.
About the self.
About the self, yeah. What makes us us?
Now, Balibar also digs into this connection that Locke makes between personal identity and property,
Oh, yeah.
which at first glance seems like a bit of a leap.
Yeah, it might seem like that, but it's really important.
Okay.
It's crucial to understanding Locke. His theory of property in oneself, the idea that we kind of own our thoughts and actions, it becomes a cornerstone of his political philosophy.
So the idea of individual liberty, that we have a right to govern ourselves, that actually flows from this concept of like owning our very selves.
Precisely. And what Balibar highlights is that this puts Locke in this lineage of thinkers who place subjectivity at the very heart of philosophy. Now, it's important to be clear about what he means by subject, because that term can be a little slippery.
Yeah, sometimes it sounds like subject refers to like a substance,
Yeah.
almost like the soul.
That's the traditional way of looking at it, but Balibar's pointing out that Locke is getting at something much more dynamic, not the subject as a thing, but as the experience of being self-aware. It's about the becoming. It's a process.
That distinction seems really important, especially when we're trying to understand how Locke was different from other thinkers of his time.
Absolutely. So take Descartes. He was all about the I, that fixed point of certainty. But Locke, as Balibar shows us, he saw the self as something constantly forming and reforming through this act of consciousness reflecting on itself and its experiences.
So a constant state of evolution, as opposed to a fixed state.
Exactly. And this is where Balibar's comparison of Locke to Spinoza becomes so interesting.
Right. So they both kind of rejected the traditional idea of free will, but the reasoning was very different.
You're right. For Spinoza, free will was an illusion. Everything in the universe was determined by these unchanging laws of nature.
Okay.
But Locke's rejection of free will, it was rooted in his moral philosophy. He felt that true freedom came from our ability to identify with our actions, to take ownership of them.
So it's not about some external moral compass.
Right. It's through this self-appropriation that we become responsible.
That's a subtle but really important distinction. It seems like Balibar is encouraging us to look beyond, the surface level readings of these philosophers and to really appreciate the nuances of their arguments.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Balibar's work so rewarding.
Right.
He's not just giving us a summary, he's really diving deep into the core concepts that are driving their systems.
So we've talked about consciousness, personal identity, property, and the subject. But there's one more key term that Balibar unpacks. I think we need to explore it,
Yeah, I think so too.
and that's person. It keeps coming up, but I'm not sure I fully grasp how Locke is using it and why it's so significant.
Well, Locke himself called person a forensic term, meaning it was primarily used in legal and moral contexts.
Okay.
But Locke takes this term and gives it this deeper philosophical meaning.
So he's going beyond that strict legal definition.
Yes. For Locke, being a person, it's not just about being a legal entity or even having a particular kind of soul.
Right.
It points to something much more fundamental about what it means to be a self-conscious being,
Okay.
capable of reason, reflection, and being responsible for one's actions.
That's a crucial distinction, especially when we're talking about Locke's time period.
Absolutely. He was challenging centuries of philosophical and theological tradition that tied personal identity to the soul or some other fixed substance.
So for Locke, being a person is more about having this certain kind of consciousness, one that is capable of self-reflection and moral responsibility.
Exactly. And this has huge implications. It lays the groundwork for our modern ideas about moral responsibility, individual rights, even the concept of human dignity.
But this idea of person also brings up some other interesting questions. Balibar delves into this problem of personality, and specifically the idea of multiple personalities that Locke explores. Remember those thought experiments?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Locke was way ahead of his time exploring these edge cases of personal identity.
Right.
These scenarios like the day man and night man sharing a body but having distinct consciousnesses. It forces us to think
It really does.
about what constitutes a person and what happens when that sense of self is fragmented.
It's like he's really testing the boundaries of selfhood,
Right.
pushing us to consider the limits and possibilities of what it means to be a person.
And just to make things even more
More complex.
complicated, yeah. Locke makes this distinction between man and person, which can be, I admit, a little confusing.
I have to admit, that's where I get a little lost.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those two terms for Locke?
So it is a subtle distinction, but it's important. For Locke, man simply refers to the biological organism, the physical body.
Okay, so man is about our physical existence.
Right, but person goes beyond that. It refers to the self-conscious being, the one who thinks, feels, remembers, and is accountable for their actions. So person is defined by their consciousness, not just by being a biological entity.
Okay, that makes sense. So a man could, age, lose limbs, whatever, still be the same person as long as that consciousness remains.
Exactly. That's why Locke can even imagine these scenarios like body swapping
Right.
or souls moving between bodies. He's trying to pinpoint what truly makes us us, and it's not just our physical shell.
That's a pretty profound idea, and it seems like it would have some pretty big implications for, for how Locke views the afterlife.
You're absolutely right. The afterlife was a major concern for Locke. This distinction between man and person is really key to understanding his views on, judgment and the possibility of an existence after death.
Okay, so how does this play into his thinking about the afterlife?
For Locke, the continuity of consciousness, not the body, is what matters. It ensures we're held accountable even after our physical bodies are gone.
But how does that work? Our bodies decay.
Well, Locke argued that God could preserve our consciousness even without the body. He even suggested that God might give us new bodies in the afterlife.
Wow, that's quite a thought.
Right, ones that would be better suited to our resurrected state.
It all hinges on this idea that our consciousness is what defines us, not the physical form.
Absolutely, and that seems to be a thread that runs through all of Balibar's analysis.
It does. Now, Balibar's book also delves into how these ideas about consciousness, personal identity, even the afterlife, were all tied up with Locke's views on language and how language shapes how we understand the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Locke wrote a whole book about language, right? How does Balibar tie that in?
Well, he does a great job of showing how seemingly separate areas of Locke's thought were actually really interconnected. For Locke, words weren't just labels for things in the world, they were signs of our ideas about things.
So language is more about our internal world, not external reality.
Precisely. And that has huge implications for how we think about communication, knowledge, even the nature of reality.
It makes you wonder, if words are just signs of our ideas, does that mean we can even think without language?
Well, Locke believed we could. He made a distinction between mental propositions, which are ideas connected in our minds without words, and verbal propositions, where we use language to express those thoughts.
Interesting.
But he was also very aware of the limitations of language.
Because words can be ambiguous or misleading.
Exactly. Locke argues that words can be meaningless if they don't correspond to clear, distinct ideas.
Right.
He was worried about how language could distort or even hide our thoughts.
That makes sense. We've all had that experience where we try to explain a thought, but the words don't quite capture it.
Right. And for Locke, this gap between thought and language, it was a serious philosophical problem.
Especially when trying to understand ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly. So to try and bridge that gap, Locke really emphasized clear definitions and paying close attention to how we use words. Okay. He advocated for using language precisely so words accurately reflect thoughts.
Sounds like a tall order.
It is, but it would have been crucial for Locke's project.
For sure, for understanding consciousness and personal identity.
Absolutely. To Locke, clear thinking requires clear language. Without it, we can't really grasp who we are.
That's a powerful connection. So language isn't just about talking to each other, it's a tool for self-knowledge.
Exactly. And Balibar takes this analysis even further, by exploring how Locke's ideas about language are tied to his ideas about personal identity. Specifically, he looks at names.
Oh, right. Names. How do names fit into Locke's theory of personal identity?
So Locke makes this distinction between proper names like John or Mary and general terms. He argues that proper names are attached to the man, the body, not the person.
So even if our consciousness evolves, our name stays the same because it's tied to our body.
Precisely. Which shows how important the physical body was for Locke as a marker of identity, even though he also stresses that continuity of consciousness.
For personal identity,
Yeah. It's subtle, but it's crucial.
it is. And it makes you wonder about how language shapes our sense of self.
It does. If our names are linked to our bodies, does that mean our identities are fixed or predetermined? It's a question that Locke doesn't fully answer,
Right.
but he does recognize how powerful language is in shaping how we think, while still saying that consciousness plays an active role.
It's this interplay.
It is. Between language, consciousness, and the body.
And what I find so fascinating about Balibar's work is that he brings out these subtle complexities.
Yeah.
He's revealing these layers of meaning that we often miss in more traditional readings of Locke.
I think that's a great place to pause.
It is. It's been a whirlwind, but I'm really starting to appreciate the depth and complexity of Locke's thought.
Me too. And we've only scratched the surface.
Right.
There's so much more to explore in Balibar's analysis, like how this concept of difference plays out in Locke's political philosophy and how he interacts with other thinkers.
I can't wait to delve deeper into those areas in the next part of our conversation. Until then, keep those philosophical gears turning, listeners.
Picking up where we left off, it's really interesting how Balibar brings out the subtle ways that difference is woven into Locke's political philosophy. So remember how we talked about Locke's idea of property in oneself?
Yeah, the idea that we kind of own our thoughts and actions.
Yeah.
And that becomes the basis for his ideas about individual liberty.
Exactly. Balibar argues that for Locke, this right to self-ownership, it stems from the fact that each person is inherently unique and distinct.
So our differences are what justify our claim to freedom and autonomy.
Precisely. And this idea has some pretty big implications for how Locke views the relationship between the individual and the state.
Okay.
You know, if individual difference is the foundation for rights,
Right.
then the state can't just come in and impose one set of rules or beliefs on everybody.
So it seems like Locke's philosophy would naturally lead to a society that values pluralism and tolerance.
That's a key insight. Locke argues that the state has got to respect the diversity of its citizens and allow for some degree of pluralism, right? It can't just suppress individual expression or impose a single ideology.
So this emphasis on difference isn't just a philosophical principle for Locke, it's the political one.
Absolutely. And it's a principle that is still debated and contested today. You know, think about all the discussions around freedom of speech, religious tolerance, and the rights of minorities.
Right.
These are all deeply connected to Locke's ideas.
Balibar's analysis is really helpful, I think, in understanding the historical roots of these debates and also just appreciating how complex these issues are.
It really does. And it reminds us that, you know, Locke wasn't writing in a vacuum.
Right.
His ideas, they came out of this particular historical context, you know, a time of a lot of social and political change.
17th century England was a time of revolution, civil war,
Right.
a lot of religious debate going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Locke was right in the middle of it all. And his philosophy, it reflects the struggles of his time.
And it also shaped the course of history.
It did.
That's what makes studying intellectual history so fascinating. It's not just about like old books and abstract ideas.
Yep.
It's about understanding those forces that have shaped our world
Yeah.
and still influence us.
Right. I totally agree. And Balibar does a great job of putting Locke's work within this larger historical context. But he doesn't just focus on the big picture. He also looks very closely at the details of Locke's arguments.
You're talking about his close readings of the text.
Exactly. He really delves into the essay and the two treatises, very carefully analyzing the language,
Right.
trying to bring out those little nuances.
So it sounds like Balibar is going beyond just summarizing.
Yeah.
He's really grappling with these ideas,
Yeah.
trying to uncover those complexities and challenge some traditional interpretations.
That's exactly what he's doing. And it's through these close readings that Balibar reveals how radical Locke's thought really is. You know, he shows how these ideas that seem pretty straightforward about consciousness, personal identity, political liberty, they actually contain the seeds of much more radical possibilities.
That's fascinating. Can you give me an example? Like, how does Balibar uncover those possibilities?
Well, take Locke's discussion of man and person, which we touched on earlier.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
On the surface, it seems like this basic distinction between the body and the thinking self.
Right. Man is the biological being, while person is the self-conscious being.
Exactly. But what Balibar argues is that this distinction, it has these far-reaching implications that go way beyond Locke's immediate concerns.
Mm.
By separating personhood from the physical body, Locke opens up this possibility of thinking about the self in ways that challenge traditional notions of identity.
Well, it's not about having a soul
Right.
or even a specific type of body.
It's about this capacity for conscious experience and self-awareness.
That's pretty radical for Locke's time, especially considering all the, social and political hierarchies that were in place.
It was radical. And Balibar says this radical potential in Locke's thought has often been missed or kind of downplayed.
Right, by more traditional or conservative readings of Locke.
Exactly. It's like Balibar is trying to reclaim Locke.
To show us how radical he really was.
And in doing so, he's opening up new ways of understanding not just Locke, but also, the whole history of Western thought.
I'm starting to see how Balibar's work isn't just about Locke.
Yeah.
It's about challenging us
It is.
to rethink some of our fundamental assumptions about the self, about society, even about knowledge itself.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes identity and difference so compelling.
Right.
It's not just a dry academic book. It's like this call to action,
Right.
an invitation to really engage with these big questions.
I'm ready to take up that challenge. But before we go any further, I think it's important to acknowledge that Locke wasn't writing in a vacuum.
Right.
He was in dialogue with other thinkers of his time, and those conversations really shaped his own philosophical development.
You're absolutely right. And Balibar pays attention to those philosophical dialogues, particularly Locke's engagement with Descartes and Spinoza.
We touched on those comparisons a little bit,
Yeah.
but I think it would be good to delve a little deeper.
Okay.
What were some of the key points of agreement and disagreement?
So one of the most striking things they agreed on was their rejection of the traditional idea of free will.
Okay, but they had different reasons for rejecting free
I
will.
agree did. For Spinoza, free will was an illusion because he saw everything in the universe as determined by these unchanging laws of nature.
Okay.
So human actions were just part of this giant web of cause and effect. There's no room for genuine free choice.
A very deterministic view of the world.
Exactly. But for Locke, the problem with free will was that it suggested this radical indeterminacy
Right.
that actually undermined moral responsibility. He felt that if our actions were truly uncaused, then how could we be held responsible for them?
So Locke's rejection was driven by ethics, while Spinoza's was more about his metaphysical beliefs.
Precisely. And this is really important for understanding how their philosophies diverge.
Okay, so they agree on rejecting free will, but for very different reasons. What other points of agreement does Balibar point out?
They both emphasize how important it is to understand the causes of our actions. If our actions aren't truly free, we need to figure out what drives them.
Makes sense. If we want to change our behavior,
Right.
we need to know where it's coming from.
And both Locke and Spinoza were really committed to this idea of a scientific and rational understanding of human nature.
So both are concerned with understanding those causes.
Yeah.
But how are their approaches different?
Well, Spinoza, he takes this really broad, holistic view.
Okay.
He sees human actions as part of this giant web of cause and effect, but it encompasses the whole universe.
Okay.
So for him, everything's connected. And to understand us, you need to understand this grand scheme of things.
Almost like a mystical view, seeing that interconnectedness of everything.
It does have that mystical quality, yeah, but it's also based on this rigorous philosophical system, Spinoza's philosophy, it's complex
I bet.
and challenging, but also really rewarding if you're willing to put in the effort.
So Spinoza's all about the big picture,
Yeah.
right? The cosmic web.
Yeah.
What about Locke?
Locke is more focused on the individual mind
Okay.
and the processes that shape our actions.
The inner workings.
He's not so concerned with the grand scheme of things. He's more interested in what's going on inside.
So Locke's like a psychologist of the mind, and
Yeah.
Spinoza's like a cosmologist.
Right. That's a great way to put it. And those different approaches lead to really different conclusions about, the self, morality, the relationship between the individual and society.
And this brings us back to Balibar's central theme, identity and difference. How do these different ways of understanding the causes of behavior play out in Locke and Spinoza's ideas about the self?
That's a great question. For Spinoza, the self is ultimately an illusion. It's this temporary modification of this one infinite substance that he calls God or nature. We might feel like we're a separate self, but Spinoza says that's just because of our limited perspective.
So our sense of being an individual It's all an illusion, a trick of the mind.
That's how Spinoza saw it.
Wow.
And that leads to a really different view of morality. For Spinoza, good and evil, they're not absolute.
Okay.
They're relative to our needs and desires.
Hmm.
What's good for one person might be bad for another. There's no ultimate standard.
That's definitely a challenging perspective.
It is, but Spinoza isn't about easy answers or comforting certainty.
Right.
He's challenging us to see the world in a new way.
Might be a bit unsettling for some listeners. What about Locke? Does he offer a more comforting view of the self?
Well, Locke's view is more individualistic than Spinoza's, that's for sure.
Yeah.
He sees the self as distinct, defined by consciousness and the ability to be self-aware.
Okay.
And that idea of the individual self is the basis for his theory of rights and limited government.
Right. We talked about how Locke thinks individuals have that right to self-ownership.
Exactly. And for Locke, this right is based on the idea that each individual is unique, capable of reason, and responsible for their own actions.
But Locke's individualism, it doesn't lead to chaos, right? He still sees the need for order and for people to live together peacefully.
Right. And that's where his theory of the social contract comes in. He argues that individuals agree to give up some of their natural freedom
Okay.
in exchange for the protection that a government provides.
So it's like a trade-off. We give up a bit of freedom to get the benefits of a stable society.
Exactly. And for Locke, this social contract is the foundation of legitimate government. Governments get their power from the consent of the people. And if they abuse that power, if they become tyrannical, then the people have a right to resist.
It's incredible how these ideas are still relevant today.
I know.
We see them reflected in our debates about democracy, human rights, limits of power.
It really shows the lasting power of Locke's thought, And Balibar helps us to understand the complexity and nuance of these arguments, as well as the historical context.
Yeah, it's clear that Balibar really admires Locke.
He does.
But he's not afraid to look at him critically.
He's not.
He doesn't shy away from the potential problems or limitations.
Right. Balibar's careful, He recognizes how brilliant Locke was, but he also points out those areas where Locke's ideas might be incomplete, maybe even a bit contradictory.
Can you give me an example of where Balibar pushes back on Locke?
Well, one area is Locke's concept of property. Remember how much emphasis he puts on the right to private property?
Right, he sees it as essential for freedom and self-ownership.
Exactly. But Balibar points out that Locke's idea of property is, well, it's a bit ambiguous.
Okay.
And potentially limited.
How so?
Well, for example, Locke doesn't really explain how property rights are initially acquired. He talks about mixing your labor with the land, but he doesn't really explain how that justifies the initial acquisition.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a bit of a gap there.
There is. And this gap has caused a lot of debate and controversy,
I can imagine.
both back then and today. Think about all the arguments about land ownership, intellectual property, and the distribution of wealth. These are all issues that are connected to Locke's ideas.
So while Locke's idea of property is really powerful, it also has its problems.
It does. And Balibar's analysis helps us to see both the good and the bad,
Right.
He wants us to really think critically about Locke, to appreciate his ideas, but also to recognize those blind spots.
It's good to remember that even the greatest thinkers are products of their time.
Yeah.
And their ideas should be open to debate and scrutiny.
Precisely. And I think that's one of the most important things we can learn from Balibar's work, He's encouraging us to approach philosophy not as a way to find absolute truths,
Right.
but as a way to keep questioning, challenging, and refining our understanding.
That's not how a lot of people think about philosophy.
No, it's not about memorizing doctrines.
Right.
It's about embracing that messy, complicated nature of reality.
This has been such a fascinating discussion so far. We've covered so much, from Locke's idea of consciousness to his political philosophy.
It's been a lot, hasn't it?
And Balibar's been a great guide.
Oh, he's been amazing, hasn't he?
I'm starting to see Locke in a completely new way.
Me too. And you know what? We're not done yet.
Oh, there's more.
There's more. We still need to explore how Locke's ideas have influenced later thinkers and how they still shape our understanding of ourselves and the world today.
Okay, well, I can't wait to hear more about that in the next part of our conversation. Listeners, stay tuned for more insights from Balibar's Identity and Difference. Welcome back to our deep dive into Etienne Balibar's Identity and Difference. We've been exploring his fascinating take on John Locke, his concept of consciousness, personal identity, even his political philosophy.
Yeah, and throughout it all, we've seen how this idea of difference keeps coming up, right? It really makes us think about Locke in a new way, a more complex way.
It's been quite a journey so far, and I'm curious to see where Balibar takes this. Like, how does he connect all of this to the bigger picture? How have Locke's ideas resonated throughout history, and do they still matter today?
Well, Balibar's point is that Locke's work is not just some historical relic.
Right.
It's a source of inspiration, insights for anyone grappling with those big questions, about self, society, knowledge.
So Locke's not just some figure from the past. His ideas are still relevant for us today.
Absolutely. And Balibar makes those connections by tracing how Locke's ideas have influenced later thinkers, especially those who were trying to understand, multiple personalities, the fragmented self.
That reminds me of that thought experiment, the day man and night man,
Yeah.
where Locke imagines two consciousnesses in the same body. It's like he was predicting later developments in psychology, even psychiatry.
Yeah, he was definitely way ahead of his time. And Balibar points out that these thought experiments, they weren't just for fun for Locke.
Right.
They were part of this bigger project of understanding what it means to be a person and what happens when that idea of the self gets broken apart.
So Locke was already asking these questions about consciousness, the unity of the self, even multiple selves in one person. Those are questions we're still asking today.
Exactly. And what Balibar is saying is that Locke, by being willing to consider these radical possibilities, he paved the way for later thinkers to explore them further.
It's amazing how a philosopher from centuries ago can still have so much to teach us about the human mind
I know, it's really incredible.
and about who we are.
It really is a testament to the power of philosophy to deal with those timeless questions, the ones that keep coming back.
Now, Balibar also connects Locke's ideas about consciousness and personal identity to his political philosophy.
Yeah, to his vision of the citizen subject.
Right, the citizen subject.
He argues that for Locke, this idea of the citizen subject is like inseparable from his understanding of the self as a conscious, thinking being capable of reason.
Because if we're capable of self-government, then
Yeah.
we have that fundamental right to freedom and autonomy.
Exactly. And that right, as we've been discussing, is rooted in Locke's concept of property in oneself.
Right, we own ourselves.
We are the proprietors of our thoughts, actions, and that has big implications for how Locke views the role of government.
So what role does government play for Locke?
Well, for Locke, the government isn't there to tell us how to live. Its purpose is to protect our rights and freedoms,
Yeah.
to make sure we can pursue our own goals and live by our own values.
So limited government, where the state's power is limited by, the consent of the people and respect for individual rights.
Precisely. And this vision of limited government is really tied to Locke's view of the self as rational, autonomous, capable of making their own choices.
Okay, but isn't there a tension there? Like, how can we be both free individuals and subject to political authority?
That's a great point. It's a paradox that's at the heart of modern political thought. And for Locke, the way to resolve it is through the idea of consent.
Okay, so we freely consent to be governed. We choose to give up some freedom to get the benefits of living in a society, right?
That's right. Locke argues that legitimate government has to be based on the consent of the governed. We're choosing to limit our freedom a bit, but it's to create a society where our rights are protected, where we can live in peace.
But what happens if we don't consent? What if we disagree with the government? Or we feel like our rights are being violated?
That's an important question, and Locke recognizes that the right to consent includes the right to withhold consent. He says we have a right to resist tyranny, to overthrow governments that are unjust.
So it's not about blindly obeying, it's about holding those in power accountable.
Exactly. And that idea that we can resist tyranny, it's been a powerful force for change throughout history.
It's incredible to think that Locke's ideas from so long ago still have such a big impact.
They do. It's a real testament to his work and to the power of ideas to shape things.
Balibar's book has been so helpful in understanding Locke, but he doesn't just praise him, right? He also asks us to think critically about those ideas and their limitations.
You're right. He does remind us that Locke was writing in a specific time and place.
Right.
We can't just take his ideas and apply them without thinking to our own time, which is very different.
So those ideas about liberty, limited government, consent, they're still valuable.
They are.
But we have to be aware of their limitations
We do.
and engage with them thoughtfully.
Exactly. And that's what Balibar gives us, a framework to do that. He wants us to read Locke closely, appreciate him, but also challenge him, and think about how his ideas might need to be, updated or reinterpreted today.
It's a reminder that philosophy is not about easy answers.
It's
It's
not.
about constantly questioning and refining our understanding.
And that's really what Balibar's book is all about. It's like an invitation, to think deeply, to question what we think we know, and to engage with Locke's legacy.
Well, on that note, we'll leave you to keep pondering these complexities. Until next time, keep diving deep.